Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy you're back here with me. I hope you are doing well and being kind to yourselves and all your parts. Today, we are going to talk about the final chapter of Outshining Trauma by Ralph de la Rosa. And it's bittersweet because it's sweet because I think this is the first book that I have actually gone through every single chapter. I did a lot on Martha Sweezy's IFS for Shame and Guilt. But this is the first one I've gone chronologically every single chapter and really done a book study on. And of course, it's bitter because you know, Ralph is Ralph is here, but not in the flesh. And what's interesting is the chapter today, chapter 20, is all about grief. And it's fascinating, that it reminds me of when Derek Scott passed, and Derek had done so much work on grief and meeting with our grieving parts and had written so much about it, even in Derek's book. And so it was like Derek was helping us grieve the loss of him. And very similarly, unintentionally, I believe, but Ralph, at the end of their book, has a beautiful chapter on grief, which we can use their teachings to even help us with the grief over the loss of Ralph themselves. So, the title of chapter 20 is Love with Nowhere Left to Go. And Ralph quotes, the whole book has been kind of an integration of IFS and some Buddhist beliefs and practices. And so there's a saying that says in Buddhism that says, meditating on the difficult points has the most value. A lot of times, as I've talked about, our parts kind of try to escape or suppress or deny difficult realities in our lives, and they're trying to protect us by doing that. Those are our restoration parts, our managing parts. Often, also our firefighters can do that. But actually being able to go toward, like the last video in Tonglen, right? Being able to go toward or invite closer the difficult things has a lot of value. And one of the most difficult things in life is the loss of, particularly of other humans that we cared about, but can also be pets. Um, it can be our home, our the life that we knew before, or our safety, lots of things that we can grieve. Um, and I like how Ralph says, on the path to healing trauma, there is inevitably much to grieve. And I know that that was my discovery, is that so much of trauma work is grief work. So much of even nonviolent communication and learning how to respect and love ourselves and care for our own needs and respect and love others and give them their needs or meet their needs, for freedom or whatever it may be, requires so much grief that a lot of people don't talk about in nonviolent communication, right? That when you realize that another person cannot meet your need, there's grief. There's a letting go of that strategy, of that person's capability of meeting our need. Um, in trauma work, there's often so much grief around what our childhood could have been but wasn't, right? That we can't get back, or the longing that we have for how we maybe would have been treated but we weren't. The loss of what could have been. Or the loss of our innocence, the loss of our safety, the loss of connection, right? Those are just really, really painful things. Loss is just one of the most painful things on this planet in these bodies. So Ralph says on page 223, we feel the loss and the feelings deserve space. That's definitely been my experience, that my grieving parts, often what they want is they just want to be able to take up space, to be able to express themselves, to be heard, to be held. And so often I'll say, my grief or my sad parts are like companions that travel alongside me all the time. And every now and then they'll get activated and they'll come up more and they'll be like, Mommy, Mommy, I need help. I need comfort. I need witness. Right. And if the parts of me who typically will try to suppress them trust me enough that myself can handle the grief, myself is bigger than that, right? Then they allow that grief to come up. And it always goes better. And they had to have experience with that to see that that's true. Um, I just have a part that wants to say, because I like to give real-time examples. I had a really sad part coming up this morning and was just allowing it to come up through tears and kind of embracing it, sitting in stillness, making space for it on the bed. And there were parts that were saying, um, you know, you need to imagine what your ideal emotional state would be, and that kind of you wouldn't even have bouts of sadness or feel sad about anything. And myself just gently reminded that part, no, that's not exactly what healing looks like. It doesn't mean that we don't feel emotions. It actually looks exactly like this, like allowing the sadness to come up and witnessing it and holding it tenderly. Or whether it's sadness or an angry part that wants to express itself or a fearful, anxious part that wants to express itself, that health, contrary to popular belief, for many of my protective parts, is not never feeling emotion or pushing it down and controlling it and looking happy all the time. For me, especially with my highly sensitive system, it's allowing all of those emotions space to breathe, to express themselves in a loving environment. So, um, all right, let me continue. Again, on page 223, Ralph says, reaching for resolve here was a more complex matter. Um, and they're talking about, especially when life is taken too soon, when someone, your child or a friend, someone young, dies not of natural causes. Um, Interestingly, Ralph's talking about that this is a much more complex matter. In this context, what the part stuck at the funeral, because Ralph is talking about his own friend passing, and so there was a part stuck at this funeral, and the same, what the part stuck at the funeral needed was something different, for someone to sit down with them and say, yeah, this is hard. This hurts a lot. There's not really an answer here, and I don't know what to do, but I will be right here with you through it. That there was a lack of solution, that the connection, Ralph says, is more powerful than problem solving. And this is 100% my experience, especially with my sad parts. They don't appreciate problem solving, fixing, because it feels to them like that they're trying to be pushed aside, right? Just get over it. Let's just fix it. Let's move on. Um, or, spiritual bypassing parts, or parts who are, want to reframe. What my sad grieving parts need is just to be allowed to feel as they feel and to be with, right? I love the reframing or the the restating of the compassionate witness of self as the compassionate withness of self. That it, most people that I've known who are grieving, and certainly myself during deep grief, I just want someone to be able to be with me in a kind, tender, compassionate way, and to not judge or dismiss or try to get rid of my sadness, but to allow space for it. right? Um, and for whatever else is there, right? The longing, the anger. Um, so uh, on page 224, Ralph talks about how the Talmud says that when a person dies, an entire world dies with them. That we don't just lose the person, we lose the whole world that lived inside them and manifested all around them. That's why when you lose a person's physical presence in these bodies on this planet, the pain is all the mundane little things where their presence was there and now it's not. The absence of that is what, in my experience, is so painful because it's not just the loss of that person, it's the loss of their energy and their presence infused in a whole world that existed. And so Ralph expresses something that was so true of my system when my first husband died by suicide. Ralph says the biggest question that that I believe Ralph's talking about, yes, when their good friend passed suddenly, was where did you go? I remember just being in bed and just like desperately saying, where is he? Where did he go? It's like he was here one moment and now he's gone. Where is he? Right? I think that that's something that if you've experienced the loss of a loved one that you might have experienced, just kind of this desperate cry of there's an emptiness. Where is this person that used to be here? How is this possible? How does it make sense? Right? There's a kind of an incredulousness about it. Um, and I remember one of the most comforting things for me was when I was in my imagination, I was like kind of crying out to God in those nights. And I remember one of them, I got just this really clear, confident sense. It was a message of he's with me and he's fine. And he knows he's loved now. He didn't know that in his body on that planet, but he knows fully now. And he's with me. He's with love, capital L love, and he's fine. And it was really comforting to me. And I've since, listened to a lot of or near death experiences. And I am really convinced that our loved ones, when they pass, uh, number one, Ralph does talk about this here in a certain tradition where I'll get to it, but where our loved ones are aware of us whenever we bring them to mind when they're in a certain space, kind of like they're traveling between realms, I guess. I'm convinced that they're aware of us continually whenever we bring them to mind because the laws of time and space don't exist beyond this matrix, this dimension. And so even though they're not here physically, which is a huge loss, and it's very true that they're not, um, that their essence and their spirit is available to us at any moment, more than it could be when their physical bodies had to bring it to us, right? Or we had to log on to it is similar to that though, right? Like we're not physically together right now, and we may not even be, in the same time. You may be watching this at a different time than I'm creating it, but we're still able to connect. Our essences are able to connect. And so in that way, there's no time and space, right? And I'm convinced that after people pass, that there there is a way if we learn to perceive with different senses, even what's called telepathic senses, right? It's the way that I communicate with my parts and I receive messages from something that's not physically tangible. It's very similar to receive messages from people who have passed. But I didn't intend to go on about that. Maybe I'll make another video about that. Um, and I like Ralph says that uh, they took this class on death and dying, and that in the class, it was like they were learning all of these techniques to help people manage their pain, get over their grief, um, you know, get it to go away and be better, essentially. Like that's what the whole class was about. And by the end of the class, Ralph raised their hand and said something like, I feel like we're doing everything except meeting the matter head on. I can feel us squirming around in our seats all semester as if to say, please tell me there's a way to make this something other than what it is. Please tell me there's some way for me to avoid this fate too, right? There's just such um, uh, a desire to get away from reality. And so Ralph says, still, I would prefer times 1,000 to learn how to face these matters squarely than to reach for some way to dumb and dull it all down. And um, I do think I remember someone saying, the only way to get over grief is through, right? And that some people may have had a loss that was 20 years prior, but they've never allowed themselves to really feel the grief and move through the grief. And so it's constantly threatening to overwhelm their system. For me, it feels like a pressure cooker. Like it just builds and builds and builds, and it's right there. I think might have talked about this in the last video as well, that the parts who are feeling so desperate, they're constantly pushing up to be seen. And so the managers up here are trying to keep them down because they're afraid that they're going to come up and like never go down. They're just going to escalate forever. But what they don't understand is that if they allow them to come up and express themselves, it actually comes in a like a crescendo, and then am I saying the right word? Yeah, it crescendos and then descends. That it's like a wave that comes and up and then down. Um, and then I like how Ralph says at the bottom of 224, grieving is respect. Grieving is honoring. Grieving, as terrible and earth-shattering as it can feel, is imperative. To continue to avoid that grief is to push living parts of us further and further into the dark recesses of the heart. It is particularly tragic. It is a particularly tragic form of self-cruelty. Um, and then Ralph says, grief is love wearing a different mask. Grief is love that has lost its object. And um, yeah, I think allowing the grief to be there is allowing the love to be there, allowing the memory to be there, allowing, that they say that the pain is equal to the love. And it's just a different expression of our love. And when our parts who try to push it down or maybe shame it are able to relax, they find that it's pain but not necessarily suffering. I really believe that it's the suffering, the layer of suffering is caused by the parts who are saying, don't feel that. You shouldn't feel that. You're bad for feeling that. Shouldn't you be over this by now? You're a mess. Kind of some of the critics will cause that shame, and other people outside of us can do that as well. But when we just allow it to be there, we realize that it's not going to take us over and there's nothing shameful about it. And that um, there's a sweetness even to allowing ourselves to feel the loss and allowing ourselves to bring that person or whatever was lost closer to us. And that parts long for us to do that. Okay. Um, okay, I'm gonna skip some parts. Let's see. Um, Yeah. Ralph says grief can feel enormous when we sense it in the background wanting to emerge. It's like that constant push, right? Um, uh, It's yet another reason we often feel a resistance to this path. We subconsciously sense that if we are true to truly wake up, there will be many shadows to face. Yet we're already facing those shadows since they are what we carry with us. They have been coloring our experience this whole time from the subterranean layers of the subconscious. Thus, we either face them implicitly or explicitly. And honestly, facing them explicitly and directly is the quicker and easier way. Yes. So, whatever, this is what it's, we gently help our protective parts understand is that whatever they push into the shadows, whatever they exile, whatever they push into the subconscious, actually becomes like this rudder that directs everything we do, but we just don't see it. There's not as much awareness of it, but it is still controlling and directing everything. But when we can bring the unseen into the scene, when we become aware of it and we can look at it plainly and clearly, now the one who sees it, which is ourself, is the one who's in control rather than everything that's been pushed underneath. Yeah, and Ralph says sometimes the resistance is the worst part, right? So I was trying to say that the resistance is actually a lot of times what brings the suffering on top of the pain. Um, so let's see. Ralph is talking about kind of different forms of grief and talks about anticipatory grief that can happen, especially when someone has a long illness and there's just a lot of pain knowing that this loss is coming. Um, And Ralph says, we're made of many parts. Of course, they don't all feel the same way about what's happening. And each of those parts just needs to have their turn and their place in the process. Um, and that's probably my biggest advice around grief, too, is just to make enough space to allow different parts that are having different emotions, different perspectives, different experiences to come up and just express themselves. Often there's nothing to do. It's just they want to be heard. They want to know that they're seen and heard. That's what every part and person wants, right? And then Ralph does talk about complex grief, which is when someone's death gets mixed in with other trauma. This I circled, often happens when our abusers die, which is I had lots of complex grief around my first husband's death because he had been my abuser. I had parts that were felt guilty. He died suddenly, violently by suicide. And so it was, there's just so many layers of trauma around the death that, it took years to kind of unpack and listen to all those parts and how they were affected. And I just continue to do that, right? Our healing always occurs in this moment as we love whatever is alive in us in this moment. And so it's not like we don't ever feel again. It's that we learn to love whatever is feeling in this moment and listen to them and see how they make sense and what, again, just recently I was doing something called a focusing technique, which is very similar to IFS. I mean, it is IFS in my opinion, but where I was listening to parts who were feeling sadness around my son and him not communicating with me. It feels very much like the grief of someone who's alive. And but then mixed in with that grief was all kinds of shame and guilt and fear, panic. And so I was asking those parts to explain themselves and just listening. And they were explaining that with my first husband, we separated and I had a lot of grief of like losing someone who was still alive, but losing them in my life. And then a year later, he died by suicide and I lost him in the flesh completely, and that was a different layer of grief. And so my parts were saying this is our experience, that we lose someone who's alive in essence and then they die. And so they were connecting that this pattern happened here, so it must mean that this pattern is going to happen with our son here. And it helped me really understand why they held fear and guilt and all those layers, that it was related to what had happened over here. And so whenever those parts come up, there's just a gentle, patient listening to them. And as I listen, everything makes sense. And I can say, that makes sense why you're feeling so much anguish over this. Um, and I want to gently remind you that this hasn't happened. And while that was very painful, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same pattern that will happen here and lots of other things, right? So then there can be self-leadership and inner parenting of those parts. But it's all about connecting to the parts. Um, and I like how Ralph says, lay the grief in the light of self, and we will honor what we need to honor, learn what we need to learn, and feel what we need to feel in order to find resolution. There's just always a freedom and a permission for the parts to be afraid, for them to be angry, for them to be sad. That's just part of our experience on this planet. Um, Yeah, Ralph says, in facing the reality of loss, we begin to ponder crucial matters of the heart. We can let all our pettiness fall away and acquiesce to life's supreme importance, life's supreme tenderness, and turn toward the loved ones that are still here. Yeah, so I do believe we can connect to people who have passed, and it helps us not take for granted, whatever time we may or may not have with those who are here. Okay. Let's see. On page 228, Ralph says to turn away from grief and loss is not just to disrespect the dead, it is to rob ourselves of the chance to have our priorities rearranged in a wiser way. My hope is that with the warmth of self-energy in mind, we can stop sending our grief underground to calcify and find a middle path where we can compassionately face it little by little. Yes, I love that. I often tell people in grief, the way it has worked for me is what I call reversed labor pains. Hi, Yasu. The dog is coming over. Um, it's like reverse labor pains. When you're in labor with a baby, that there's pain and it gets more and more intense and closer together as the baby's being born. And after someone leaves the world, the pain is very, very intense and close together right after. And then it gradually gets a little further apart, and less intense until it's just a hum, or to me, again, it's like this constant companion that goes along with you that reminds you of the love. And sometimes it can get activated by various things, and we turn toward it, right? But it can be really helpful to both our grieving parts and our restoration parts, the parts who don't want us to feel all the things because it's inconvenient and painful, to set appointments with our grief. That was really helpful for me. And early on, it was an hour to 3 hours a day. I mean, it was a big chunk. Um, but again, it's just whatever your system will allow. And then gradually it got shorter and shorter. But um, because my grieving parts knew that there would be time during the day when they could come out and fully express themselves, the restoration parts, and that the restoration parts would allow that, they would tend not to come and flood during other parts of the day. And again, I often liken it to a pressure cooker where, you release the valve, you release the pressure a little bit at a time. It's not all at once. It's, just releasing that pressure a little at a time. And as we allow a little bit of it to release and be met with compassionate witness, the accumulation of the pressure gradually decreases. Okay, so Ralph says, okay, so how do we process? Um, Ralph says the essence of grief work is to find a way to bear witness to the feelings and thoughts until our parts are ready to be unburdened. And then talks about Tonglen being a really good practice here. Tonglen's underlying message is we can face the full truth of our lives, the entire spectrum from joy to sorrow, and we can turn it into medicine. So Ralph says the basic formula remains the same. Meet whatever your parts are holding with self energy. Do it at a pace that does not overwhelm you, and be patient enough to stay the course. Firmly remind yourself that though it seems endless, nothing is endless. There is another side to this, a brighter side. Yes, so it's just a constant meeting whatever's alive in us at the pace that is not too overwhelming for our system. Yeah, then Ralph talks about, different cultural customs, like in Judaism, the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva, and how there was this designated time where basically the restoration parts were allowed to get off the hook, right? There was no cleaning, no cooking, no going anywhere, um, just nothing that you had to participate in. And so you could designate this full week to nothing but allowing the grieving parts to be there and to not feel like you had to put them underground. I have a part saying right now, just reminding me of when my first husband died. It was like my grieving parts had to be pushed to the side for all the logistics of, the week or two after figuring out how's he going to be buried and what are we going to do for the celebration of life and all these different things and people coordinating bringing food to me and different things like that. And it wasn't until all of that was passed that my system could really collapse into grief. And so they're saying, gosh, yeah, what would it have been like if we didn't have to? Because it felt like holding my breath those couple weeks. It felt like I'm just trying so hard to hold it together, hold it together, hold it together, hold it together, until I can feel authentically, essentially. Okay, now on page 229 is when Ralph describes the Tibetan Bardo practice. I think this is what I was talking about earlier, and it's a 49 days after a community member has left the earth. There's this kind of designated 49 days of ritual and prayer because the belief is that the essence of the person has entered the bardo, which is translated as the in-between. So they're kind of awaiting a new body or a new life or that kind of thing. And so the community is sending prayers to the person, and there's this sense that every time they bring them to mind, they are aware of them, and they're kind of reminding them of their Buddha nature, right, or their self energy, and kind of speaking. I think the idea of this is that it might be somewhat of a difficult place to be in, and so they're kind of trying to encourage them and send them love and light and all those things. Um, okay, let's see. On page 230, I say I love this. So let's see what this says. Um, Ralph says, in my online classes, especially the ongoing ones where we've all really gotten to know each other, anytime someone shares about the recent death of a loved one, oh, I do love this practice. Anytime someone shares about the recent death of a loved one, we stop. I have the community member tell us a little bit more about the person, what they look like, what they were like as a person. And I lead the group in a short meditation where we wish for this person to not get caught in confusion and to go home into the clear light, the dawning of their true nature. And Ralph says, again, does it help the person who's died? I don't know. But I do know that it helps the grieving party to face the loss directly, and it gives the community around them a way to support them in that. So, yeah, it's just I think obviously you want to be like if you're on the side of um, trying to know how to respond to someone else who's grieving, of course you want to be sensitive if you're trying something and are saying no. Um, but I think asking the person, especially if you didn't know that person, what did they look like? What do you remember about them? And they might cry, they might have pain again because the memory of them, the love for them, the loss of them is causing the pain, and that's okay. And you can show that you're okay with them expressing pain, right? That the love and the pain are very intermingled. And or maybe if you knew the loved one that they lost, you could talk about the things that you remember about them and just keeping their memory alive and um, what delighted you about them, that kind of thing. Okay, so Ralph says the end game of grief. Their existence was a gift, knowing them was a privilege. There's gratitude and there's celebration for having been able to connect to that person or that perhaps animal, that essence um, on this planet. And so, again, there can be a real mix of emotion, and that's completely fine, right? To feel the sadness, to feel the anger, to feel the uh, where are they, uncertainty, incredulousness, right? And to also feel gratitude and joy and appreciation for the time that we did have with that person. Um, so I'm not going to lead you through this exercise. Ralph actually has several exercises. I'll just tell you really quickly about them. And, if you want to go through them, you can get the book. But one is just about saying goodbye, because Ralph was saying that the grieving process often gets stuck when we feel like we haven't been able to say goodbye. Which for me with my first husband, because it was sudden, it definitely did, there was a lack of closure about it. But because we had separated and essentially said goodbye to each other in our lives before that, I guess there was a sense of closure in that way. But yeah, I can imagine if someone passes suddenly. So Ralph has an exercise where you write a letter and just communicate with them about what you would have said to them, what you want them to know, uh, etc. Um, and then there's a practice about that Ralph calls offering compassion and prayers to the one we've lost. That reminds me kind of the Bardo exercise of kind of just reminding the person of their nature, their self nature of love. Um, and then finally, Ralph has a Tonglen or parts work practice for our grieving parts. Um, um, and I'll just mention here, I like as this practice Ralph has, because a lot of times there are a lot of parts who have various responses and reactions and things that they want to be known. And so Ralph says you can create a really comfortable, beautiful waiting room, and they can each take their turns, as if they're coming into your office or into your garden. And the most important thing is that they each have space and time to fully express themselves, to just be seen and heard and understood and loved. Um, at the end of this chapter, Ralph says, keep going and all will become clear in the sunlight of self. It is just a matter of time. Um, and I wanted to let's see, there is a kind of a conclusion also, and I just wanted to say one or two things from that. I really liked on page 236, Ralph says, please know that I am deeply honored to have offered you any exposure to these processes of awakening, even in the slightest. Tears form in the corners of my eyes as I type. And I just thought that was so sweet, that I am very much convinced that this book was such a labor of love. Um, and then Ralph encourages us, that we are the new cartographers, that to create, Ralph encourages us to create our own amalgam of ways and practices that suit us specifically. That reminds me, I have the t-shirt that says N equals one, which is really about like the sample size of the experiment is one. It's you. And really, I guess it's more than one because you're a multiple. And it's, all of your parts and what works for them, what doesn't work for them, just testing and approving things, experimenting with things, creating a toolbox that is uniquely yours, right? Like I might, it during the course of going over all the beautiful practices in this book, right? I remember I did some practices that included breath work, and people wrote back and said, I just have parts who panic and are terrified of focusing on my breath. And I said, oh, that's okay, right? Don't bypass those parts. Get to know those parts if you can. Get curious about their concern, and they do not have to do this, right? The breath is just one path. It's just one inlet into self energy, into capital L love, right? It might be for you to go in nature and put your feet on the ground or stare up at the stars in the night sky. It might be to co-regulate with your animal. Um, it might be to create and to draw, create music, to dance. It might be self-massage, whatever. Just try lots of things. Be open to trying things, but don't be attached to anything, right? That it doesn't have to be this or that. You can just test and approve and go, this really works for me. And maybe it works for you today and it doesn't tomorrow, So you're always open and flexible to feedback. So I encourage you, especially around this topic of grief, to create a practice that is life-giving for you, that honors your restoration parts, but honors your grieving parts, that is exactly the right setting, environment. Um, some people might want loud music, and some people might want very quiet, contained space. So it's all about whatever helps you feel safe, first and foremost, feel loved, get your needs met, right? For belonging, for freedom, for purpose, for expression, all those things. So, I know I was kind of here and there in the chapter today and kind of sharing a little bit of my experiences, past and present. But if you want to share anything in the comments, you're welcome to, about um, maybe your own journey through grief and what has helped you and what hasn't, because that could be helpful for people in the community in the comments. Um, loss and grief are something that touches every one of us at some points or many points of our lives. And so it is like a common human experience. Again, what helps us may not be exactly the same, but it is really helpful to know that we're not alone, that other people are experiencing that pain as well, and that it's okay, that it's normal to feel it, and to kind of navigate finding ways to make space for it in your life and still continue on. Um, so yeah, share what's helped you, share your experience with grief in the comments if you're willing. And let's see, if you have watched this far, um, I'm just looking at the flowers behind me. So put in an emoji of a flower or two, and I'll know that you watched and were with me during this. And I send you all love, all your grieving parts. They matter. They are welcome. All right. See you next time. We'll see. We'll see what I talk about next time.